Hello, girls and vogues, Lena here. Today, I've got a story about a woman who literally fell from the sky into the wrong country. And the officer who was supposed to turn her in, but closed the door behind them both instead. 7 days in hiding, one impossible border, and a feeling neither of them asked for.
The night everything changed. I understood that power means nothing when the wind decides for you. I was 34 years old, running a company worth millions, with a reputation I'd built with surgical precision. But all it took was a storm to strip me of everything I thought I controlled. I fell from the sky like an intruder, and what I found when I touched the ground wasn't just another country. It was the woman who would force me to become someone I had never been. My name is Adriana Leclerc. I grew up learning never to show weakness. Family dinners weren't about feelings. They were about expansion, numbers, strategy. The flight that morning wasn't leisure. It was a private demonstration for investors who needed to see audacity in real time. The sky was clear, almost too perfect. No one predicted the storm cell that would form within minutes. The first gust shoved me several meters toward the mountain ridge. I tried to correct course, pulled on the lines, shifted my body weight. The equipment shook like it was protesting. The signal from my ground crew began to cut out. I heard my name through static, then nothing. When I saw the current pushing me toward the restricted zone, I knew exactly what that meant. That aerial boundary was not to be crossed. Not by accident. Not ever. The storm wrapped around me with unexpected violence. The wing lost tension, and the paraglider began descending erratically. It wasn't a clean fall. It was a chaotic descent, branches snapping, a spin that left me completely disoriented. The final impact knocked the air from my chest. Everything went silent, except for a sharp ringing in my ears. I woke up with my face pressed into wet dirt and blood. The forest was denser than anything I'd seen from the air. I tried to activate the locator. Nothing. No signal. No network. No rescue. And then I knew with absolute clarity. I had landed in Velmora, the territory no one mentioned out loud. The country where a trespasser wasn't a mistake. She was a threat. I didn't hear the officer arrive. I saw her when she was already just a few meters away. Dark green uniform, metal insignia, and a posture that left no room for improvisation. Her eyes were pale and cold, but not cruel. She aimed without trembling. I raised my hands with difficulty. I tried to explain in my language that it had been an accident. She didn't respond. She just watched me the way someone watches something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The woman introduced herself with a single firm word. Ilyanova. I'd learn later that her full name was Mara Ilyanova, Lieutenant of Aerial Surveillance. In that moment, I only knew she had the authority to end everything with one call. I watched her hand move toward the radio on her shoulder. If she activated it, I'd be surrounded by soldiers within minutes. The line between my life and imprisonment depended on that one gesture. But Mara didn't make the call. Her eyes dropped to the broken equipment, then to the foreign logo on my gear, then back to my face. Something shifted in her expression, barely visible. She switched off the radio with a sharp movement, said nothing, offered her arm to help me up. It wasn't compassion. It was a decision. As we moved through the trees, my weight against her steady shoulder, I understood that the real fall hadn't been from the sky. The real fall would be trusting the only person who could turn me in. And without knowing why, as the forest swallowed us in silence, I felt that my life no longer entirely belonged to me. If this story is pulling you in, hit subscribe right now, and drop a comment below telling me, what would you have done in Adriana's place? Would you have trusted Mara? We walked for what felt like hours, though I later learned it was barely 40 minutes. Mara moved with precision, leaving no obvious tracks, avoiding marked paths. She didn't speak. She didn't try to explain anything. I could barely keep myself upright. Every step reminded me that I was dependent on the one person who was supposed to arrest me. When the forest began to thin, I saw a low structure of wood and stone, almost camouflaged between the trees. It wasn't a military base. Too discreet, too isolated. Mara unlocked the door with a key she'd kept tucked beneath her jacket. Inside was sparse. A table, a small wood stove, a bunk bed, and a piano draped with a gray cloth. She sat me down in a chair, not roughly, but without softness either. I scanned the space quickly out of habit. No visible cameras, no official insignia. This didn't look like a detention facility. It looked like a personal refuge. She retrieved a first aid kit and began cleaning the wound on my forehead. Her hands were trained and firm, but careful. When the cloth touched broken skin, I held back a wince. Our eyes met for the first time without a weapon between us. Hers weren't cold. They were contained, as if every emotion had been filed away under layers of discipline. I tried speaking again, slower this time. Accident. Storm. Not a spy. I pointed to the wrecked paraglider, then to my chest. She understood more from context than from words. Her lips formed something in her language, and I caught only one word she kept repeating clearly. Border. Her hardened expression made it clear my landing was not a minor detail. I had crossed a line that was never supposed to exist. Mara stepped away for a moment and looked out the window, assessing the perimeter. Then she returned and pointed to the door, then her watch, then made a deliberate gesture for silence. I understood the basics. No one could know I was there. That realization hit harder than the fall itself. She wasn't turning me in. She was hiding me. And if this story has already got its hooks in you, my Patreon is full of even more content. You'll find exclusive stories, longer chapters, bonus scenes, and richer details that bring every romance and plot twist to life. Find out more right below. The inevitable question settled in my mind. Why? What did she gain from this? A surveillance officer doesn't risk her career out of improvised compassion. There was something more. Maybe curiosity. Maybe doubt. Maybe she simply didn't believe I was a threat. But in Velmora, even doubt was dangerous. I tried to stand and explore the space, and a sharp pain in my ribs forced me to stop. Mara reacted immediately, stepping in to catch me before I went down. Her hand at my waist was brief and functional, but the closeness shifted something in the air. We were too near each other, too aware of each other. She was the first to step back, as if remembering her own limits. She set down her jacket on the table. I saw then a thin scar running across her forearm. It wasn't recent. It wasn't shallow. That mark told a story that needed no translation. For the first time, I thought that this woman didn't just follow orders. She had survived them. Mara picked up a small device and typed something. Then she turned it toward me. On the screen, a basic translation appeared. You stay here. No one can see you. I nodded. I had no alternative. But in that moment, I understood that the real confinement wouldn't be physical. It would be emotional. Trusting her meant binding myself to her decision. When night fell, the forest became a dark murmur around the refuge. Mara lit a dim lamp and sat down at the cloth-covered piano. She hesitated before lifting the gray drape. Her fingers touched the keys with caution, as if the act itself was more forbidden than hiding me. The first note filled the space with an unexpected softness, and as I listened to her play in secret, I knew that the woman who could destroy me wasn't just an officer. She was someone who also lived keeping parts of herself hidden. I didn't know how long I'd been listening before I understood. This wasn't an official melody. It wasn't a hymn or a traditional Velmoran piece. There was something foreign in the structure, something free in the cadence. Mara played with precision, but not with rigidity. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if the piano was the only place where she didn't need to be lieutenant. When she finished, she kept her hands suspended above the keys for 1 extra second, as if she couldn't decide between continuing or remembering where she was. I didn't applaud. I didn't speak. I was afraid of breaking something invisible. She covered the piano with the gray cloth again, and the gesture was almost more painful than the music itself. It was like watching someone close off their own breathing. She looked at me, gauging whether I had understood too much. I nodded slowly. I didn't know her language, but I understood the language of silence. We slept at opposite ends of the refuge. Me in the bunk. Her in a chair, her firearm resting on the table. The image was absurd. A businesswoman who fell from the sky and an officer who was supposed to arrest her, sharing a roof by unilateral decision. And yet I didn't feel afraid of her. I felt afraid of the world that made her keep watch even when she closed her eyes. The next morning, Mara left before dawn. I watched her straighten her uniform in front of the small metal mirror, every crease aligned with precision. When the door closed behind her, the refuge shrank. I walked slowly through the interior, studying every detail. There were few personal objects: a worn mug, a book without a cover, a handkerchief folded with excessive care. Nothing that shouted identity. Everything contained. I reached for the book. I couldn't understand the words, but I recognized the foreign alphabet. It wasn't from Velmora. I set it back exactly where I'd found it. I sensed that book was as much a secret as the piano. I wondered how many layers Mara had. How many versions of herself she kept hidden beneath that uniform. When she returned, she brought a bag of basic food and fresh bandages. She indicated she needed to check my ribs. This time, when her fingers pressed the injured area, I didn't look away. She didn't either. The closeness stopped being accidental. It was a conscious tension, even if neither of us named it. There was no romance in it. There was recognition. I tried to communicate something different. I traced an imaginary map in the air, drew a line, then crossed it with my finger. "Go back," I said in my language. Mara shook her head firmly. Then she reached for the translation device and typed, "Not now." 2 words that landed like a sentence. The day passed in a kind of silent truce. I helped where I could, cleaning, organizing, trying not to be a burden. She watched me from the corner of her eye, as if trying to figure out whether I was really what I appeared to be. I suppose I was doing the same with her. It was strange how danger could transform into something almost domestic. As evening came, we heard a distant sound. Engines. Mara reacted instantly. She took my arm and led me to a hidden trapdoor beneath a heavy rug. She opened it and gestured toward the narrow space below. I didn't argue. I descended. From the darkness I heard voices in her language. Firm, interrogative. My heart slammed against my ribs. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I could recognize the tone of someone demanding answers, and the tone of someone giving carefully controlled ones. Mara never raised her voice, never hesitated. When the engines faded, she opened the trap door. Her eyes were more tense than before. She said nothing, but the message was clear. They were already searching, and I was the reason. When I climbed out from under the floor, the air in the refuge felt heavier. Mara sealed the trapdoor and repositioned the rug with precision, then stood still for a moment, listening to the exterior silence as if she could detect a betrayal in the wind. My pulse was still racing. Having been hidden beneath her feet while other officers questioned her had made my situation brutally real. This was no longer an aerial accident. I was an active risk. Mara set her firearm on the table and ran a hand through her hair, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture of exhaustion. It was the first visible crack in her composure. I stepped closer cautiously. I didn't know her language. but I understood body language. I pointed to the door, then gestured leaving. I didn't want to be the cause of her fall. She shook her head, more intense than before, then picked up the translation device and typed, "If you leave, you die." The bluntness of it chilled me. She wasn't exaggerating. In Velmora, a foreign trespasser had no right to explain anything. I looked at her eyes, searching for something beyond authority. I found determination. She wasn't protecting me out of pity. She had decided to protect me. And that decision already had consequences. The silence between us grew heavy. I was used to negotiating, to talking until I convinced people. But here, words were clumsy and incomplete. I walked toward the covered piano. I touched the gray cloth and looked at her as if asking a question without sound. She tensed her jaw. She knew I was crossing an invisible line. With slow movements, I lifted the cloth. Mara took a step toward me as if she might stop me. She didn't. I pressed one key. The sound was clean and delicate. Then another. I improvised a simple melody I'd learned as a child. Something my mother used to play to ease family arguments. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. When I finished, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was vulnerable. Mara spoke for the first time beyond short commands. I didn't understand the words, but I felt the intensity. She stepped closer, picked up the device, and typed quickly, "That is forbidden." She pointed to the piano, then the window, then her uniform. I understood. Foreign music, outside influence, a sanctionable offense. I looked at her steadily and said slowly in my own language, "Do you always obey?" She didn't need a translation to catch the challenge. Her eyes darkened. She stepped toward me, closing the distance until I could almost feel the steadiness of her breath. She picked up the device and typed only 2 words. "It's survival." The conviction in her posture wasn't arrogance. It was experience. I don't know exactly when it stopped being a debate and became something else. Maybe it was the accumulated tension, maybe the shared fear, maybe the certainty that we were both out of place. I held her gaze without looking away. She didn't retreat either. The space between us was small enough to choose. The kiss wasn't sweet. It was brief and almost reckless, a collision of decision rather than romance. There were no lingering touches or promises. Only an electric confirmation of something neither of us had planned. When we pulled apart, the air felt different, more dangerous. Mara was the first to step back. She moved away as if she'd just crossed a border more serious than any geographical one. Her fingers closed into controlled fists. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In her gaze, there was something new. Not regret, but awareness. We had just turned a political secret into something personal. And in Velmora, the personal was the most dangerous thing of all. Mara didn't look at me for several minutes after the kiss. She moved through the refuge with exaggerated efficiency, as if external order could undo what had happened. She adjusted the window, checked the perimeter, straightened the weapon on the table. I stayed beside the piano, still feeling the current that had passed between us. It was not something that could be pretended away, but she was trying to do exactly that. That night she didn't play. She barely spoke beyond the strictly necessary. Before she turned off the lamp, she typed on the device. It was a mistake. Nothing more. The sentence hung between us like a warning. I nodded, even though inside me there was no mistake. There was certainty. And that difference placed us in very different positions. At dawn, Mara left again for her shift. This time she took longer to come back. The extended silence forced me to think too much. What had last night meant to her? Weakness? Insubordination? Desire? I was used to women who chose without asking permission. But Mara didn't live in my world. In hers, choosing could cost more than reputation. It could cost freedom. When she returned, her expression was harder than usual. She brought news without needing words. She typed, "Inspections are increasing." Then added, "They're looking for signs of impact." The storm had left traces in the forest. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. Our arrangement had stopped being improvisation and turned into a countdown. I tried to keep physical distance that day, respecting the boundary she seemed to be enforcing. We cooked together in silence, sharing tasks without touching. But the absence of contact didn't eliminate the tension. It made it more evident. Every time our hands reached for the same object, we both paused a fraction of a second before pulling back. In the afternoon, we heard engines again, closer this time. Mara moved swiftly but without panic. She led me toward the hidden trapdoor and, before I descended, she held my face in both hands for a moment. The gesture was brief and grounded, like someone confirming they can trust what they're about to protect. It wasn't a kiss. It was something quieter, a direct, steady connection that needed no translation. From below, I heard voices more forceful than the night before. A male voice seemed to insist. Mara's tone was controlled but more strained. I recognized a word repeated several times. Nothing. She was denying me, denying that I existed in that place. The risk was no longer hypothetical. When the footsteps faded, she took longer to open the trapdoor. When I emerged, I noticed a faint new mark on her cheek. I didn't ask how it happened. It wasn't necessary. She picked up the device and typed, "They're suspicious." Then she looked at me directly and added, "I can't protect you if they find out." It wasn't a threat. It was the truth. That night we didn't speak about what had passed between us, but before turning off the lamp, Mara sat down across from me. No piano, no long translations. She only typed one more sentence. "I don't want you to die." It was the first declaration that had nothing to do with duty or strategy. Something inside me settled with an unexpected clarity. I moved toward her slowly, without crowding her. I didn't kiss her. We didn't need to repeat anything. I rested my forehead against hers for a second that felt more intimate than any impulsive gesture. She closed her eyes, barely. And in that shared silence, I understood that the distance she had been trying to impose wasn't to protect herself. It was to protect me. The suspicion was no longer a distant shadow. It was a concrete presence breathing behind every tree. Mara left earlier than usual the next morning. Before going, she left the device on the table with a single sentence already typed. "If I'm not back by nightfall, don't go outside." No explanation. None needed. The clarity in her eyes said more than any translation. The hours passed slowly. The forest seemed to be listening. Every creak of a branch made me think the door was about to fly open. I walked back and forth, unable to focus on anything. I looked at the piano, the foreign book, the worn mug. This refuge was no longer just a hiding place. It was the place where something inside me had begun to change. I, who had always made cold decisions, was waiting for someone as if my life depended on it. When the door finally opened, Mara came in with her uniform slightly disheveled. It wasn't carelessness, it was consequence. She closed the door quickly and leaned her back against the wood. She was breathing harder than usual. She moved to the device and typed without preamble. "They searched my sector." Then she added, "A commander is coming tomorrow." That word landed heavier than any other. Commander meant superior authority. It meant real scrutiny. I stepped closer, trying to hold her gaze. "I can leave," I said in my language, gesturing toward the mountain. She shook her head before I finished the motion. She typed with firm strokes. "The border is sealed. They will shoot." Then she added something that undid me. "I won't risk that." Not, "I won't risk my career." That, my death. The tension between us was no longer just emotional. It was physical, immediate. The risk had become tangible. The possibility that everything could end in a single inspection forced me to face the obvious. We were not two women trapped by coincidence. We were two accumulated decisions, and both of us knew time was running out. Without thinking too hard about it, I stepped closer, until the distance disappeared again. This time it wasn't defiance or impulse. It was need. Mara held me by the shoulders as if weighing whether to push me away. She didn't. The kiss came differently from the first. Deeper, more conscious. It didn't carry anger or surprise. It carried acceptance. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission. Her hands moved to my back with a restrained steadiness, each touch measured against its consequences. It wasn't recklessness, it was contained intensity. The outside world, the inspections, the commander, all of it suspended for one minimal but absolute moment. When we separated, her forehead came to rest against mine. We breathed at the same rhythm. She picked up the device and typed slowly. "This will destroy us." I lifted my eyes and answered quietly, knowing she wouldn't catch every word. "Then let it be worth it." We didn't need a complete translation. The meaning was in our eyes. That night we didn't sleep immediately. We spoke in fragments, mixing languages, gestures, and glances. I learned that Mara had chosen the military because it was the only path to stability in Velmora. That discipline was a form of protection. That the piano was a memory of someone no longer there. I told her I had built my life proving I needed no one. We were both lying a little when we called ourselves strong. When we finally turned off the lamp, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was conscious. Outside, the forest kept its secrets. Inside, we had chosen something with no guarantee of survival. And for the first time since the fall, I understood that it wasn't the accident that was transforming my life. It was the decision to stay. Dawn came too soon. Mara hadn't slept more than a few scattered minutes. I watched her straighten her uniform in front of the metal mirror, each button like a promise she had to uphold. Before leaving, she typed, "He comes today." She didn't need to clarify who. The commander was already a presence breathing inside the refuge without being physically there. When the door closed, the silence expanded. But this time I didn't pace without direction. I traced the rough map I'd built in my mind across those days. I remembered the wind direction, the slope I'd tumbled down after the fall, the approximate position of the ridge. There was one possible route out. Dangerous, unstable, but possible. The idea of leaving began as logic and ended as conflict. If I could reach the mountain line before nightfall, I might find a signal on the Arcanian side. My company would mobilize resources. International pressure would force a negotiation. But every step outside the refuge meant exposing Mara. Her false report was already a crack. If I disappeared suddenly, suspicion would harden into certainty. I spent hours debating in silence. I had always been pragmatic. Solve the problem, minimize damage, move forward. But this time the calculation wasn't financial. It was human. Leaving meant saving myself. Staying meant choosing her. And I had never before placed another person above my own strategic survival. I heard footsteps outside before the sun was high. They weren't Mara's. They were heavier, more assured. I hid by instinct in the compartment beneath the floor, but this time the sound of the door opening wasn't abrupt. It was firm, controlled. Male voices filled the space. The commander had arrived earlier than expected. From below, I could distinguish the interrogative tone. Mara responded without wavering. The commander seemed to move through the refuge, reviewing objects, opening drawers. I felt the air grow scarce. If he lifted the rug, it was over. Not just for me. For her. Time stretched until it became unbearable. The footsteps stopped directly above me. I heard the scrape of a boot against the rug. Then silence. The commander spoke in a lower, sharper voice. Mara answered something I couldn't understand, but her tone was firm, almost challenging. There was a moment when I thought everything would break. But the footsteps finally moved away. When the door closed again, she waited several seconds before opening the trapdoor. Mara looked at me with a blend of strain and resolve. There was a slight tremor at her jaw, barely visible. She typed, "We can't keep going like this," then added, "They know something is missing." The inspection had been only the beginning. I came out of hiding and faced her. I pointed to the imaginary map, then the mountain, then myself. "I'm going," I said clearly. She shook her head with more force than ever. She picked up the device and typed, "There is a route, but it's dangerous." She looked at me directly and added, "If you go, I'll take you." That sentence changed everything. It wasn't just protection, it was a choice. Mara was willing to cross a line larger than hiding me. Escorting me to the border implied open betrayal. It implied desertion. It meant leaving behind the only structure she had ever known. I stood watching her in silence, understanding the full weight of what she was offering. That night we didn't speak of love. We spoke of routes, timing, patrol schedules, wind currents. But beneath every technical word, another truth was beating. If we crossed together, there would be no easy return. And as we traced the plan on the table under the dim lamp, I understood that the most difficult border wasn't geographic. It was the decision to walk it without looking back. We didn't sleep. The route was laid out on the table like a silent pact. Mara explained with gestures and scattered words where the terrain became unstable, where patrols changed shift, where the mountain offered enough shadow to hide us. I watched her, not as an officer, but as a woman about to abandon everything that had defined her. There was no drama in her face, only clarity. We left before dawn. The forest was still covered in low mist that softened every outline. We moved quickly without speaking. Mara went first, setting the pace, analyzing every sound with an attention that bordered on obsession. I followed her steps with precision. Every meter we advanced was a surrender on her part. The first stretch was clean. The terrain climbed steeply but without interruption. When the sun began to rise, we heard the distant sound of engines. Mara stopped cold. Her eyes swept the horizon with practiced speed. These weren't routine engines. There were too many of them. The silhouettes appeared between the trees before long. This wasn't a casual patrol. It was a directed search. Someone had connected the pieces. Mara pushed me toward a rock formation and whispered a word I already understood. "Run." But I didn't move. If I ran alone, she would be left exposed. The soldiers surrounded us within seconds. The commander stepped forward, with the same composure he had used to inspect the refuge. His eyes moved from me to Mara without surprise, as if he had anticipated exactly this scenario. He spoke in a firm tone. No translation was needed to know he was accusing her. Mara stepped forward before I could. Her posture returned to that of an officer. She straightened her shoulders, held the commander's gaze, and spoke with steadiness. I caught only fragments, but I understood the essential. She was taking responsibility. She gestured toward me as a trespasser she'd detected late. She placed herself between them and me, not as a lover, but as a shield. I tried to intervene, to say she had been forced into it, that it was my fault. One of the soldiers held me back before I could step forward. It was then that Mara turned toward me for the last time without intermediaries. No device, no translation, just her eyes. She came close enough that the commander couldn't stop her without creating a larger scene. Her hands held my face with steadiness. The kiss wasn't impulsive. It was decided. It didn't carry the urgency of fear, but the depth of a conscious farewell. The forest, the soldiers, the mountain. Everything disappeared in that compressed instant. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against mine for one brief second. Her lips moved with a sentence in her language. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the meaning. It wasn't a promise. It was a choice. Then she stepped away and raised her hands in surrender. They led me in the opposite direction from her. I didn't know if it was a transfer or an interrogation. I only knew I never saw her look back. And I understood that the woman who had decided to protect me until the end had just crossed a line without any immediate return. The fall was over. Now the consequences began. The interrogation was brief and methodical. They took me to a concrete facility, no visible windows, where the commander asked questions that didn't need complete translation to reveal their intent. They wanted to know how I had crossed. They wanted to confirm whether my presence was part of something larger. I answered what was essential: accident, storm, loss of control. I didn't mention the refuge. I didn't mention the piano. I didn't mention Mara beyond the unavoidable. International pressure did the rest. My company had noticed the disappearance, activated protocols, mobilized diplomatic contacts. In less than 48 hours, Arcania was formally demanding information about a missing citizen near the border. Velmora denied for hours, then accepted the term preventive detention. They couldn't hold me indefinitely without escalating the conflict. The transfer was swift and silent. I was escorted to a neutral point along the mountain line. On the other side, representatives from my country were waiting. No speeches, no public apologies. Just a controlled exchange of documents and tense stares. I crossed the line with my body intact, but with something irreversibly altered. The first weeks in Arcania were a whirlwind of headlines and questions. The press wanted sensational details. The executives wanted technical reports. The investors wanted assurances of stability. I answered what was necessary and kept quiet about what mattered. No one asked about the officer who had chosen not to hand me over immediately. No one knew that her silence had been the reason I was alive. I tried to resume my routine as if it were possible. Meetings, strategies, numbers projected on enormous screens. But every corporate decision felt small against the image of Mara raising her hands before her own soldiers. Her fate was a dangerous unknown. In Velmora, disobedience wasn't an administrative lapse. It was treason. I used every available resource without exposing her directly. I pushed business forums on cross-border cooperation. I funded humanitarian initiatives to open channels of dialogue. I couldn't demand her release without revealing the connection. But I could pressure Velmora toward broader negotiations. It was a slow, calculated strategy, unlike anything I had designed before. This time it wasn't about expansion. It was about a possibility. Diplomatic conversations began months later, under mutual economic pressure. A conference was organized in the same mountain region that had marked my fall. Officially, the goal was to discuss aerial safety protocols. Unofficially, it was a political gesture to reduce tensions. When I saw the preliminary list of Velmoran representatives, my breath caught for a moment. Among the names, Lieutenant Mara Ilyanova. Not as a prisoner. Not as someone formally sanctioned. As part of the technical delegation. That meant they hadn't destroyed her. At least not entirely. On the day of the conference, the air was clear, almost cruelly similar to the morning of my flight. Formal delegations, impeccable suits, aligned flags. I attended as a business advisor on the Aerial Innovation Panel. When the delegations crossed paths in the main hall, I saw her. Mara wore her uniform with the same precision as always, but her eyes were no longer the same. They had seen the cost of a choice. We looked at each other without moving closer. Without drama, without reckless gestures. Only a sustained connection that said more than any public declaration. I didn't run toward her. I didn't embrace her. The love that had been born in the refuge didn't need spectacle. It needed opportunity. And in that instant, I understood something definitive. The fall had been an accident. But what came after was not. We chose. Both of us. And that choice had survived the border. The conference proceeded with technical speeches and carefully rehearsed diplomatic formulas. They discussed air currents, emergency protocols, cross-border cooperation. No one mentioned unexpected storms or hidden refugees in the forest. No one spoke of personal decisions that defied entire systems. Yet every time Mara and I exchanged glances from opposite ends of the room, the past felt more present than any signed document. During the break, delegations scattered into small groups. I stayed near the coffee table, pretending to review notes I already knew by heart. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. Not the steps of an officer on patrol, steadier, more measured. When she stood in front of me, the noise of the room seemed to lower without disappearing. "Ms. Leclerc," she said in my language, with a slight but clear accent. The fluency surprised me. She had learned. Or perhaps she had always known more than she let on. "Lieutenant Ilyanova," I replied with the same formality. For a few seconds, we held the professional mask. We were representatives of different territories, not the women who had kissed under threat of capture. We moved to a less crowded corner of the room. There were no cameras pointed directly at us, but there were indirect glances. The space was narrow, as if even on neutral ground, intimacy required permission. "I didn't expect you to be here," I admitted quietly. She held my gaze with a composure different from the forest. "I did," she answered. "I knew you wouldn't stay still." The phrase wasn't a reproach. It was recognition. I asked her, without preamble, what had happened after our capture. Mara explained briefly that she had been subjected to an internal review, that her decision was considered a tactical error, but not formal treason. She had argued she needed to confirm my identity before notifying. She had lied with enough precision to survive. She didn't smile saying it. There was no pride in her voice, only the confirmation that she had made it through. "You could have turned me in from the first day," I said. She didn't deny it. "I could have," she answered. "But I didn't." She didn't add justification. She didn't speak of feelings, and yet the weight of that omission contained everything I needed to hear. What existed between us wasn't a consequence of confinement. It was a repeated decision. The announcement of the next panel came over the loudspeaker. Our private time was running out. I felt the irrational impulse to reach for her hand, to erase the institutional distance between us. I didn't. Mara stepped closer, just enough that her voice barely reached my ears. "The border won't disappear tomorrow," she said, "but there is dialogue now." I understood what that implied. It wasn't an immediate romantic promise. It wasn't an improvised escape toward an easy life. It was the possibility of building something within the rules, or of slowly transforming them. I, who had always believed in fast and decisive solutions, was standing before a woman who understood the value of strategic patience. "If this continues," I asked, "would you come to Arcania officially?" Mara held my gaze without hesitation. "If there are formal agreements, yes." Then she added something not found in any document. "But I wouldn't come only as an officer." The meaning floated between us with a new clarity. We weren't talking about secrecy. We were talking about legitimacy. We were called back to the main hall. Before separating, Mara inclined her head slightly, a minimal gesture that in the forest would have been intimate, and here was discreet. There was no kiss. We didn't need one. What we shared had survived inspections, interrogations, and borders. It didn't need repetition to be real. As I took my seat on the panel, I understood that the transformation that began with the fall had nothing to do with losing control. It had to do with choosing to share it. I had lived believing that strength meant absolute independence. Mara showed me another kind of strength, the kind that holds steady even when every system pushes in the opposite direction. The conference ended with a preliminary agreement to create a cross-border aerial cooperation corridor. It was a small gesture in geopolitical terms, but enormous in meaning. When the delegations began to disperse, our eyes crossed one last time. There was no dramatic farewell, only a quiet certainty. The line that had once separated us was no longer impassable. I walked out of the building with the sky clear above the mountain ridge. The wind blew softly, almost ironic. I thought of the woman who had decided not to activate a radio that afternoon in the forest. I thought of the officer who now walked between delegations without hiding her presence. The fall had taken my control from me. But what truly changed my life was something simpler and much deeper: choosing her.